Margaret found herself alone in her expansive estate, with only the ticking of an antique clock for company. The profound silence around her reflected the emptiness she carried since the unexpected death of her husband 3 years ago. Despite her wealth, vast property, and a life filled with leisure, she felt a sense of hollowness. Her daily routine revolved around hosting polite tea gatherings with her friend Eleanor, overseeing the household staff, and reading books that only intensified her yearning for genuine connection. James had worked for Margaret for over a year. He was quiet yet attentive, possessing a dignified aura that distinguished him from others. Initially hired as a general servant, he efficiently managed his responsibilities, often predicting Margaret's needs before she articulated them. His demeanor was a refreshing contrast to the incessant chatter of the other servants. Although he rarely engaged in conversation, Margaret found herself increasingly aware of him. Eleanor, a frequent guest, quickly noticed the growing rapport between Margaret and James. During one of their tea afternoons, she chided, "He's just a servant. Margaret, you shouldn't blur the lines. It's unbecoming." Though Eleanor's tone was polite, her words were laced with an undercurrent of judgment. Margaret dismissed her comment as meddling, but couldn't shake its echo from her thoughts. One sunny afternoon, while the garden basked in the warm light, Margaret initiated a conversation with James. When she asked him to fetch a book from the library, instead of leaving, he lingered to suggest titles. Intrigued by his unexpected literary insights, Margaret inquired about his preferred authors, leading to an engaging discussion that lasted almost an hour. For the first time in years, Margaret felt genuinely heard. James listened with intent, his dark eyes focused solely on her, devoid of pretense or judgment, just a quiet understanding. She shared memories of her deceased husband that she hadn't even recounted to Eleanor. James briefly touched on his own past, omitting some details that Margaret intuitively respected. Their exchange was interrupted by Eleanor's entrance, which immediately shifted the atmosphere. Margaret noted Eleanor's disapproving look at James, who quickly excused himself. "He's quite bold for a servant," Eleanor remarked once he left. Though Margaret felt irritation at Eleanor's condescension, she remained silent. Later that evening, Margaret reflected on their conversation by the fireplace. She couldn't deny the solace James had offered her or the flicker of feelings that had lain dormant for years. However, Eleanor's admonitions about societal boundaries lingered in her mind. As the house settled into its familiar quiet, Margaret's routine subtly changed. She began to anticipate encounters with James. Unintentionally, she found herself more aware of his presence, his composed movements, the care he dedicated to his tasks, and the brief warmth in his gaze when they interacted. One evening, a thunderstorm caught Margaret off guard while reading in the parlor. A gust of wind blew the windows open, sending papers flying. James appeared promptly, securing the windows and gathering the scattered items with calm efficiency, a stark contrast to Margaret's shock. "Are you all right, ma'am?" he asked in a steady voice. Margaret nodded, aware of how his close proximity steadied her. "Thank you, James," she replied quietly. As the rain beat against the windows, Margaret seized the moment to ask him a more personal question. "Do you miss your family?" After a slight hesitation, James admitted, "I do, but life often takes us far from our beginnings." His straightforward response resonated with Margaret, who found it deeply moving. They continued talking as the storm raged outside. Margaret reminisced about her late husband, sharing joys and sorrows. James listened attentively, offering simple, comforting words while allowing her the space to express her feelings, an experience unlike any she had known in years. The next day, Eleanor arrived unexpectedly. her demeanor as tempestuous as the prior evening's weather. She had overheard gossip among the staff about Margaret and James's lengthy discussions. "You're being reckless," she cautioned. "People are starting to talk." Initially, Margaret was dismissive. "James has done nothing wrong," she replied firmly. Yet Eleanor's words lingered, sowing seeds of doubt in Margaret's mind about her own feelings. Was her affection toward James simply gratitude for companionship, or was it something deeper? That evening, Margaret wandered alone in the garden, the cool air failing to soothe her restless thoughts. She understood that society would not accept a connection between her and James, no matter how innocent. Still, she could not ignore the comfort he provided or how seen he made her feel, an acknowledgement that had faded since her husband's passing. Beneath the stars, Margaret resolved to maintain a clear boundary between them, unwilling to jeopardize James's position or her reputation. Yet deep down, she recognized that her emotions were slipping beyond her control, setting the stage for a conflict she could no longer evade. The following day, the house felt quieter, as if the walls themselves sensed the tension brewing between Margaret and James. Margaret could no longer hide the emotions that had taken hold in her heart. Each shared glance and moment of silence heightened her inner conflict. She attempted to brush it off as mere appreciation for his presence. Yet the reality was undeniable. James had become more to her, someone who reignited her spirit after years of solitude. James, too, sensed the change. Their looks were no longer casual. There was a mutual recognition of an emerging connection, overshadowed by the realities of their roles. He held her in higher regard than anyone else he had known. But as time passed, his feelings became increasingly complicated. He found himself attracted to her in ways he hadn't expected, fully aware of the implications it could bring. A man in his position didn't have the right to entertain such feelings for his employer. One afternoon, as Margaret read by the window in her drawing room, James quietly entered with a fresh tray of tea. Initially, she barely acknowledged him, accustomed to his silent arrival. Yet today felt different. The atmosphere crackled with unspoken tension. When Margaret looked up and held his gaze a moment too long, it felt like the unexpressed thoughts between them loomed large. She abruptly broke the silence, her heart racing. "Thank you, James," she spoke softly, her voice trembling slightly. James remained still, his eyes locked on her, and for a brief instant, both found themselves at a loss for words, as if time had halted, leaving only their shared silence. Margaret started, breath catching in her throat. She couldn't articulate what she wanted to say. It felt as if an irreversible shift had occurred between them. Before she could continue, the storm outside intensified, rattling the windows. James instinctively moved closer to close them. Margaret stayed in place, watching, her heartbeat quickening. When he turned back to her, their eyes met once more, and this time neither could look away. "Are you afraid of storms?" she asked in almost a whisper. The question, like yet another means to relieve the heavy silence surrounding them. "No," he answered, his tone low and assured. "Not when I'm with you." The impact of his words startled Margaret. A shiver ran through her, and for a fleeting moment, she sensed he might be implying something deeper. But before she could reflect on it, she stepped back, struggling to regain her composure. "We shouldn't," she began, the words choking her. She recognized the necessity of stopping this from progressing, avoiding a path likely to ruin everything. James had his role in her life, but it couldn't be this way. James nodded, though his expression was inscrutable. "Of course, ma'am," he replied, his tone distant, and the moment slipped away like sand through fingers. The rest of the day rolled by in strange silence. Margaret found it difficult to focus, her thoughts drifting back to James and that short encounter. She understood their relationship was fraught, even perilous. Yet it felt like the start of something she was unprepared to face. That night in bed, Margaret replayed their moment endlessly. She had overstepped a boundary, and she was aware of it. The storm outside may have calmed, but the tempest within her heart continued unabated, and she felt utterly adrift. The next morning, Margaret awoke burdened by an unsettling feeling she couldn't shake. The previous day's interaction with James replayed in her mind, and despite her efforts to dismiss it, the painful truth was undeniable. She had crossed the line. The bond that had developed between them had morphed into something far riskier. Each glance and subtle touch had forged a connection she wasn't ready to confront. Throughout her day, Margaret became easily distracted, her mind continually returning to James. She tried to convince herself it meant nothing, merely a trick of her loneliness. However, the reality was more daunting. She had developed feelings for him that were inappropriate, and that fear gripped her. Later, Eleanor arrived, as she frequently did, armed with pointed comments and scrutiny. Margaret barely registered her words during their conversation about the latest social happenings. Eleanor's voice echoed the life Margaret once knew, one filled with predictable routines and superficialities. It was the life she felt pressured to return to. Yet now every fiber of her being resisted it. She felt as though she were living a deception. When James brought her a fresh cup of tea, she noticed Eleanor's critical gaze narrow. Margaret's heart raced, knowing that Eleanor was keenly observing the nuances of her interactions with James. The tension in the room mounted as Eleanor addressed him with icy detachment. "James, I trust you've completed your tasks for the day." Margaret could feel the strain amidst Eleanor's scrutinizing presence. James responded politely but with distance, leaving Margaret to catch a fleeting glimmer of something in his eyes. Was it disappointment? Or something deeper? As Eleanor continued her chatter, Margaret's thoughts wandered once more. The inner turmoil she faced was unbearable. She fully understood the repercussions if she continued her discourse with James. Her social rank, her reputation, everything would be at stake. Yet the more she resisted, the more intensely she felt drawn to him. The more she insisted it was wrong, the clearer it became that she could not disregard the strong connection forming between them. That evening, alone in her room, Margaret finally confronted her feelings. She could no longer pretend that everything was fine or that her emotions were a fleeting infatuation. The painful truth was plain. She was in love with James, despite knowing he could never truly be hers. Tears filled her eyes as she contemplated the future. She couldn't remain in this limbo, torn between her obligations and the desires of her heart. She resolved to distance herself from James, to cut ties before their relationship became even more perilous than it was. It would mean losing him, but she recognized that it was the only way to protect herself. As she laid back against her pillows, the weight of her decision pressed heavily upon her. She knew it was for the best for both of them, yet part of her mourned the loss of what she never truly allowed herself to have. The ache of that loss would remain, but at least it would be a pain that kept her safe from the dangers of a forbidden romance.